Sir, I'm going to have to stop you there. That trail is closed. Ranger Cody Walsh said it with the practiced warmth of a man who has delivered this particular news several times already this morning, and has learned to do it in a way that does not make visitors feel foolish for having shown up. He was standing at the trailhead barrier on the Tennessee side of the Smokies, and the old man in the olive field shirt had just lifted the rope barrier and was preparing to step under it. He stepped back. He looked at Walsh. He did not put the rope down. "The creek crossing," he said. It was not a question. "The upper crossing is running about knee-high and fast," Walsh said. "We've had 3 inches of rain over the past 72 hours. The lower section has a gap, about 6 feet of trail just gone. I've turned 3 groups back this morning." He gestured at the closure sign on the trail board. "It's a safety closure. The trail will reopen when the water levels drop, probably day after tomorrow." The old man in the olive cap looked at the trail board. He looked at the forest where the trail disappeared into the trees. He looked at Walsh. "How fast is fast?" he said. Walsh paused. "Excuse me?" "The upper crossing. How fast is the current?" Walsh thought about it. "I'd estimate it at 4, maybe 5 feet per second, maybe more in the center channel." The old man nodded slowly. He pulled the folded waterproof paper from his shirt pocket and looked at it briefly. His own terrain sketch of this section, drawn from memory, decades old in the making. He folded it and put it back. "And the gap at the lower section," he said. "What's the bank like where the trail went out?" Walsh looked at him. "Sir, I appreciate the questions, but the trail is closed. It's not a recommendation. It's a safety closure." The old man looked at the rope barrier. He looked at the forest. "I grew up 6 miles from this trailhead," he said. "I walked this drainage before the NPS built a trail on it." He put his hand on the rope barrier, not lifting it, just resting it there. "I'd like to know the bank condition." What Ranger Cody Walsh did not know, could not have known, because the old man had offered nothing, and the NPS visitor log asked only for a name, was that August Teller had been crossing difficult terrain in difficult conditions since before Walsh's parents were born. That he had served 3 years with the 75th Ranger Regiment, still including a deployment to Southeast Asia in 1970, where his team had crossed rivers and ridges and jungle terrain that made a washed-out Smoky Mountains creek trail look like a maintained footpath. That he had spent 22 years in the Army and had come home to Sevier County in 1991 and had walked this park, off-trail and on, every year since, knowing its drainages and its creek behavior and its clay bank geology in the specific way that a man knows terrain he has been paying attention to for 60 years. And that the crossing Walsh had just described, knee-deep, 4 to 5 feet per second, 6-foot bank gap, was, by Gus Teller's private reckoning, approximately the 12th most difficult crossing he had made in his life, maybe 15th. If you believe that difficult terrain is only impossible to the people who haven't crossed it before, type Ranger in the comments right now. Because what August Teller did on that trail in the next 2 hours, and what Ranger Meta found when she arrived at the summit trailhead, is a story about the specific gap between a closure sign and the truth of what the ground can actually bear. His full name was August James Teller. He had been born in Sevier County, Tennessee, in the fall of 1947, the youngest son of a timber worker who had spent 30 years in the Smokies, and a schoolteacher who had insisted her children learn the landscape they lived in as a matter of basic education. Gus had grown up in the woods, not recreationally, the way the word is used now, but practically, the way children grow up in the woods when the woods are the world immediately outside the door. He had been navigating the park's backcountry since he was 11, before half the current trail system existed, following the creek drainages and ridge spines that are the park's actual structure and that the trails merely approximate. He had enlisted in the Army in 1966 at 18 and had been assessed, based on physical fitness scores in the 98th percentile, aptitude evaluations that placed him consistently in the top 2%, and a psychological profile that one Army evaluator had described in writing as possessing an unusually high tolerance for sustained physical and psychological stress, for special operations training. He had completed Ranger School at Fort Benning in 1967, spoke the 72-day course that was then and remains one of the most physically demanding military training programs in the world, a course that is designed not to teach soldiers new skills, but to see how they perform the skills they already have when they have not slept for 3 days and have not eaten enough and are carrying 40 pounds, and the situation is not resolving in their favor. Gus had graduated in the top third of his class, which was a different statement than it sounds, because Ranger School had a graduation rate in that era of approximately 40%. He had served with the 75th Ranger Regiment, then the 75th Infantry, the predecessor unit, from 1967 to 1970, with deployments that included a classified operational period in Southeast Asia in 1970 that remained partially redacted in public records for reasons that had nothing to do with Gus and everything to do with the political complexity of where the operations had taken place. What the records said, in the portions that were not redacted, was that his team had conducted successful reconnaissance and direct action missions in terrain that the Army's own topographic mapping described as inaccessible by conventional infantry means. What the records did not say, because no document had been written for it, was how many creek crossings and ridge traverses and bad bank situations a 6-man team in full combat load had navigated across those operational months without losing a man. Gus knew the number. He had stopped counting at 30, so he had finished his service in 1991, having spent his later years in Ranger training cadre roles, teaching the course, assessing candidates, building the specific institutional knowledge of what the human body and mind can actually do when the need is real enough. He had retired to Sevier County, the same county he had been born in, and had gone back to the woods. Not as a veteran finding peace in nature. He had never been at war with nature. But as a man returning to the terrain, he had always understood better than any other, and continuing to walk it, every season, every year. He was here today because the rain had been heavy, and the creek crossings would be running, and he wanted to see what this specific drainage looked like at high water. He had been watching this drainage for 60 years. High water was interesting. High water told you things about the creek bed that low water concealed, the true channel, the secondary channels, the rock structure of the crossing, the bank stability. He had his waterproof paper and his pencil stub. He intended to update his sketch. He had not intended to have a conversation at the trailhead rope barrier, but he had not walked away from one in 78 years, and he did not intend to start. Walsh had maintained the closure with patient professionalism. He had explained the creek levels, the bank gap, the 3 turned-back groups, the estimated reopening timeline. He had done his job correctly and completely. The old man had listened to all of it with the same quality of attention he gave to everything, complete, unhurried, processing rather than waiting for a pause to speak. And then he had asked a question that Walsh had not been asked by any of the 3 groups he had turned back. "What's the bank like where the trail went out?" Walsh had answered honestly, "Red clay, undercut at the base, approximately a 6-foot gap, a 2-foot drop to the creek level at the gap edge." The old man had nodded. He had taken his hand off the barrier rope. He had said, "I'll be back through this afternoon. If I'm not back by 3, you can call the park number and give them my name." He had lifted the rope and stepped under it. Walsh had taken a step forward. "Sir, I cannot allow—" "I know you can't allow it," the old man said, not unkindly. "I'm not asking you to allow it. I'm telling you where I'm going and when to expect me back." He looked at Walsh for a moment. The direct green eyes, the settled jaw. I've been walking this drainage since before you were born. The crossing is manageable at this level for someone who knows how to read moving water. The bank gap is a step and a reach. I'll be fine." He put his hands in his pockets and walked into the trees. Walsh stood at the barrier for a moment. He picked up his radio. He called Ranger Meta. The trail from the trailhead to the first creek crossing was 9/10 of a mile, moderate grade, the path still clear and dry under the tree canopy that had broken most of the rainfall. Gus moved at the pace he had always moved on familiar terrain. Not hiking pace, not the performance pace of someone proving something, but the functional pace of someone going somewhere. Each step placed correctly, each footfall reading the ground before it committed weight. The particular economy of movement that comes from 6 decades of not wasting energy on difficult ground, because difficult ground always asks for more of it eventually. He heard the creek before he saw it. High water has a specific sound, not louder exactly, but fuller, a deeper register in the white noise. The sound of more mass moving faster. The sound of a creek that has remembered what it actually is and stopped being polite about it. He stopped at the trail's edge where the path dropped to the creek bank and looked. The upper crossing was running exactly as Walsh had described. Knee-high at the visible ford, the center channel faster than the edges, brown with sediment, the surface reading the bottom structure in the specific way that fast, shallow water reads it. The V-shapes pointing upstream toward the shallow lines, the boils marking submerged rocks, the dark patches showing depth. He read it for 2 minutes. He found the line, not the trail crossing, which was underwater, but the natural stepping sequence that the creek bed offered if you knew what you were looking for. A shallow diagonal from river left to river right that crossed the main channel in the shallower water above a gravel bar. He crossed in 45 seconds. He did not slip. He was wet to mid-shin when he stepped out on the far bank. He stopped and looked back at the crossing from the far side. Always worth seeing both ways. Confirmed what he had read from the near bank. He made a small notation on the waterproof paper with the pencil stub. He walked the half-mile to the lower section. The bank gap was exactly what Walsh had described. 6 feet of trail replaced by a raw clay undercut, a 2-foot step down to the creek edge. He stood at the gap for a moment, reading the bank structure. The clay was wet but not actively slumping. The undercut was at the base, not the top. The gap edge was stable under boot pressure when he tested it. He looked at the far bank of the gap. A root mass from an overturned hemlock, solidly anchored, reachable with a full stride and a hand placement. He stepped, reached, landed. He stood on the far side and looked back. He made another notation. He continued up the trail. The summit trailhead was a rocky overlook on the Tennessee-North Carolina boundary ridge, a flat stone platform with views across the Smokies in all 4 directions. On a clear day, the ranges went blue to the horizon. Today, the cloud layer sat just below the peaks, which meant the overlook was above the cloud, in pale November light, with the mountains disappearing into gray below. Gus had been there before in this exact condition. Above the cloud, the ridge clear, the world below erased. It was one of the things about this specific trail that he had been coming to see since the 1950s. He sat on a log at the edge of the overlook, took out his thermos, ate the sandwich from his pack, and looked at the view. He had been there 20 minutes when he heard boots on the trail. Ranger Priya Mehta came up the far access trail, the route from the North Carolina side trailhead, which had not been closed. She was moving at trail pace, slightly winded from the final climb, and she came into the overlook and saw the old man on the log and stopped. She had driven to the Tennessee trailhead when Walsh radioed her. She had arrived to find Walsh at the barrier, the closure rope still lifted on one side where the old man had ducked under it. She had looked at the visitor log. She had seen the name. She had driven 45 minutes to the North Carolina trailhead and come up the far side. Subscribe to Iron and Honor right now and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what Ranger Mehta has in her field notebook, and what she says when she sits down on that log beside the old man on a Smoky Mountains overlook above the cloud line, is a moment that neither of them planned for, and that changed what both of them carried away from that ridge. She walked to the log. She sat down beside him. She looked at the view for a moment. Then she opened her field notebook. She turned to a page near the back, a page she had written 2 years ago during a research project on the park's pre-trail human geography, when she had gone through the County Historical Society's records and found an interview from 1998 with a man who had described the park's creek drainages from memory, in detail, in a way that the interviewer, a graduate student, had noted was more accurate than the NPS's own drainage maps for the period before 1960. The man in the interview had been named August Teller. She showed him the page. Gus read it. He read it slowly, the way you read something you said a long time ago and are checking whether you still agree with it. That interview, he said. I remember that. Or young woman from Knoxville. She had a tape recorder. She did, Mehta said. The tape is in the County Historical Society archive. The transcript is in our interpretive research files. She paused. You described this drainage, the creek bed structure, the crossing locations, the high water behavior, in enough detail that we were able to use it to correct the pre-1960 drainage map for this section. Gus looked at the view. The map was wrong about the lower fork, he said. It showed a single channel where there are actually 2. The second one only runs in high water. You can't see it from the trail. You have to walk the creek bed in October or after a heavy rain. He looked at the notebook. I walked it for the first time in 1958. I was 11 years old. Mehta looked at him. Walsh told me you went through, she said. Chuck, the crossing was manageable, Gus said. He said you told him you'd been walking this drainage since before he was born. That's accurate. Mehta looked at her notebook. She turned to the first page of the section she had written on August Teller and read a line she had written as a research note 2 years ago, when she had first encountered the name. Pre-trail knowledge, 1958 to present. Ranger background. Verification pending. She looked at the old man on the log. Your Army service, she said. I found a reference in the County Veterans Memorial Record. 75th Ranger Regiment. Gus drank from his thermos. 3 years, he said. Southeast Asia, among other places. She looked at the view for a moment. The clouds below the ridge, the ranges going blue beyond the cloud layer, the particular quality of November light on the Smokies in high altitude. The crossing this morning, she said. The one Walsh closed. Knee-high, 4 to 5 feet per second, Gus said. Manageable on the line above the gravel bar. The bank gap is stable. The undercut is at the base. The clay at the gap edge is solid. He pulled out the waterproof paper and held it out to her. I updated my sketch. The lower fork is running in the secondary channel. First time I've seen it this high since 2009. You might want to note it. Meta took the sketch. She looked at it. The hand-drawn contour lines, the creek bed markings, the notation points, the small, careful writing of a man who has been making this particular document more accurate for 60 years. She took out her own field notebook and began to copy the relevant markings. So they sat on the log together for 40 minutes. The old ranger and the young ranger, on a Smoky Mountains overlook above the cloud line. The drainage map between them getting more accurate with every note she took. Walsh was at the trailhead when Gus came back down at 2:15. He had stayed at the barrier, partly because it was his post, and partly because the old man had told him he would be back by 3, and Walsh had found, without entirely meaning to, that he had taken the statement seriously. Gus came out of the tree line and walked to the trailhead. He was dry from the knee down. He had crossed the same line on the way back, reading the water again, finding the same gravel bar. He stopped at the barrier. Walsh looked at him. He looked at the trail. He looked back at the old man. "You made it," he said. I did," Gus said. "The crossing," Walsh said. "The upper one. How did you—" "Diagonal above the gravel bar," Gus said. "The water is fast in the main channel, but the bar pushes it shallow just upstream. You cross in the shallows, not at the ford." He looked at Walsh. "You can see the bar from the near bank if you know what you're looking for. Dark patch, slightly upstream from the trail ford. That's where the depth drops to mid-shin." Walsh turned and looked at the forest, though the creek was not visible from where they stood. "I've done that crossing probably 100 times," he said quietly. "I've always used the ford." "The ford is fine at normal levels," Gus said. "At this level, the bar line is better. You can't learn that from the trail. You have to walk the creek bed in different conditions until you've seen it enough times." He picked up his pack. "Come out here after the next heavy rain. Walk the creek, not the trail. Give it a few seasons." He put his pack on. "Your colleague," he said. "Ranger Meta. She has an updated sketch of the lower fork. Might be worth looking at for your trail condition reports." He walked to his truck. He put the pack in the cab. He drove home to Sevier County, 6 miles away, on roads he had been driving since he was 16. Walsh submitted a written report that afternoon. In the additional notes section he wrote, "Subject proceeded past closure barrier stating local knowledge of drainage. Completed crossing of closed section without incident. Crossing technique described post-traverse. Diagonal above gravel bar at upper ford. Unviable at current water levels. Not in standard crossing guidance. Recommend consultation with subject for historical drainage documentation. Subject, August Teller, Sevier County. Army Service, 75th Ranger Regiment." He looked at what he had written. He added one more line. "He told me to walk the creek in different conditions. I'm going to." He sent the report. "There are men in this country who have been walking the same ground for 60 years and who know it in a way that no map contains and no training course produces. Who can read a creek crossing in high water the way a doctor reads a chart. Who can find the safe line through ground that has been declared impassable by people who have not yet seen it in enough different conditions to know what it can bear. Gus Teller has been walking this drainage since 1958. He has crossed its high water, and its low water, and its flood water, and its drought-thin summer trickle. He has seen the secondary lower fork run twice in 66 years, once in 2009 and once this November morning. He updated his sketch both times. The trail was closed. The trail was right to be closed. For 3 groups in trail runners with no knowledge of the creek bed, the closure was the correct call. For one man who has been reading this specific water for 60 years, the closure sign was a starting point, not an ending one. The difference is not stubbornness. The difference is 60 years of paying attention to a specific piece of ground in every condition it presents, until the ground itself has nothing left to surprise you with. And subscribe to Iron and Honor for the men who have been paying attention long enough that the ground itself knows them. Hit the bell. Don't miss the next one. The trail was closed. He said he'd crossed worse with 40 pounds on his back. He was telling the precise truth, and the precise truth was something that the closure sign could not contain, and the creek bed already knew.